My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28 years old, and the day my mother tried to destroy my wedding started 8 months before the ceremony in the tiny yellow-painted kitchen of the house Daniel and I rented on the edge of Oak Ridge, North Carolina, when Daniel Brooks stood in front of the sink holding a ring he had saved for almost a year to buy, his hands rough from carpentry work. Sawdust still caught in the sleeves of his shirt, and he said something simple that I will never forget. He said, "I don't have a speech, Emily. I just know that every morning I wake up I want to see you there." And before he even finished the sentence, I said yes, because loving Daniel had never been complicated. Loving him felt like sunlight coming through a window after a long winter, and for exactly 11 minutes the world felt perfect as we sat on the kitchen floor laughing and staring at the ring on my hand. But then my phone rang, and the name on the screen was the one name that had quietly controlled most of my life. Mom, Margaret Carter, and when I answered, she didn't say congratulations or ask if I was happy. The first thing she said was, "Where is the venue?" And I remember looking at Daniel confused because we hadn't even begun planning anything yet. I told her that we had just gotten engaged and hadn't decided on anything. But she interrupted me and said, "You need to decide immediately. Good venues book a year in advance. I'll start making calls." And there was something about the way she said it that made my chest tighten, because my mother had always been involved in every major decision of my life. When my father died of a sudden heart attack, when I was 19, she held my hands at the funeral and whispered, "You're all I have left, Emily. Don't ever leave me alone." And that sentence had followed me for nearly a decade like a shadow. So when I tried to tell her gently that Daniel and I wanted to plan the wedding ourselves, she went quiet for 4 seconds. I counted them because silence with my mother always meant something dangerous was coming. And then she said softly, "I understand. You don't need me anymore." And immediately the guilt flooded in like a reflex I had been trained to feel since childhood. So I said the words she wanted to hear. I said, "Of course I need you, Mom. I want your help." And the moment I said it, I heard her breathe out slowly on the phone, like someone who had just won an argument without raising their voice. And when I hung up, Daniel was watching me with that careful look he gets when he senses something is wrong but doesn't want to push too hard. He asked quietly, "Is she going to try to run the whole thing?" And I laughed a little and said no, because at that moment I still believed my mother just wanted to help. I didn't know that phone call was the first move in a game she had been preparing to play for years. And I definitely didn't know that 8 months later, nearly 200 people would show up to a wedding that my mother believed she had already destroyed. 3 months after the engagement, my mother's help had quietly turned into something else, something that felt less like support and more like ownership. But the strange thing about control is that it rarely arrives all at once. It creeps in slowly, the way water leaks into a basement during a storm, until one day you realize the floor is already flooded. It started with my mother offering to call a few vendors because I was busy teaching 3rd grade, and Daniel was buried in work at his carpentry shop. And at first I was grateful because wedding planning was overwhelming, and she seemed excited in a way I hadn't seen since my father died. But within weeks, things began to change. She started attending tastings without telling me. Then she replaced my phone number with hers on the florist's account, so they called her instead of me. And one afternoon, I walked into a cafe where she was meeting the caterer and realized she had already decided on an entire menu I had never approved. I wanted something simple and personal: pulled pork barbecue, cornbread, mason jars of sweet tea, something that felt like the small southern town where Daniel and I grew up. But my mother looked at me across the table with a polite smile and said, "Emily, you cannot serve barbecue at a wedding. People will think you couldn't afford something better." So instead, she ordered a formal plated dinner with white tablecloths and wine glasses that cost twice our budget. The flowers were worse, because I had always dreamed of wildflowers, sunflowers and lavender and baby's breath, something messy and bright and alive. But when the florist showed us the final order, my mother had chosen white roses and orchids because, she said, elegance mattered more than personality, and every time I tried to push back, she would sigh and dab the corner of her eye with a tissue. She always seemed to have ready, whispering things like, "I'm only doing this because your father isn't here to help you." And every time she said my father's name, the argument ended because the guilt inside me would collapse like a house with the supports removed. Daniel noticed all of it, even though he rarely said anything directly. He would come home later from the workshop than usual and stand in the kitchen quietly while I told him about the latest changes my mother had made. One evening, I caught him staring at a half-finished chair he was building, sanding the same piece of wood over and over without actually shaping it. And when I asked what he was thinking, he just shrugged and said, "Nothing." But I knew Daniel well enough to understand that silence meant he was holding back frustration for my sake. The only person who didn't stay quiet was Sophia Reed, my best friend since 8th grade, and the woman I had asked to be my maid of honor. She came over one evening while my mother was rearranging centerpiece samples on our living room table and replacing the ones I liked with something she called more sophisticated. Sophia watched without saying a word until my mother finally left for the night, and when Sophia followed me to the door, she grabbed my arm and looked at me with a seriousness I had never seen before and said, "Emily, I need you to trust me about something." I laughed nervously because the tension in her voice made me uncomfortable and asked what she meant, but she shook her head and said, "Don't ask questions yet. Just promise me something. No matter what your mother does during this wedding planning process, don't react immediately." I remember blinking at her in confusion because it sounded like she knew something I didn't. But before I could press for answers, she squeezed my hand once and walked down the porch steps into the dark. And as I watched her car drive away, I had the strange feeling that a second story was unfolding somewhere behind the one I thought I was living. A story I couldn't see yet, but that Sophia clearly could. About 2 months before the wedding, my mother invited Daniel to lunch without me. She called one afternoon while I was grading math homework at my desk and said casually, "I think it would be nice if Daniel and I had a little conversation about family expectations." And at the time I thought it sounded like progress because my mother had never fully accepted Daniel. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he was a carpenter who built furniture with his hands instead of wearing a suit and working in an office. And in my mother's mind, ambition always looked like a tie and a salary chart, not sawdust and work boots. So when Daniel left for lunch that Saturday, I actually felt hopeful that maybe they were finally starting to understand each other. But when he came home 2 hours later, something about the way he closed the front door made my stomach drop. He didn't storm in angry, and he didn't pretend everything was fine. He simply sat down across from me at the kitchen table and folded his hands together like someone preparing to deliver careful news. And I could see the tension in his shoulders even before he spoke. He said slowly, "Your mother told me something today," and for a moment I thought maybe she had finally apologized for being so controlling during the wedding planning, but instead he said, "She told me you had a breakdown in college." And the room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls had moved a few inches closer without warning, because it was technically true that after my father died, I had gone through a dark period during my sophomore year of college when I barely left my dorm room and eventually spoke with a counselor for several weeks. But that was grief, not instability, and it was something I had worked through quietly years ago, something private that my mother had now turned into a weapon. Daniel continued carefully explaining that during lunch she had leaned across the table and said the words, "damaged goods," and I remember gripping the edge of the chair, because hearing that phrase spoken out loud felt like being slapped by a ghost from my past. Daniel said she asked him if he was prepared to spend the rest of his life managing someone fragile and emotionally unstable. And when he told me that part, I could barely breathe, because I realized she hadn't just crossed a line, she had erased it entirely. I finally whispered, "What did you say?" "Sus!" And Daniel looked at me with the calm certainty that had made me fall in love with him in the first place and said, "I told her I don't see damage. I see someone who survived losing her father." And for a moment, something inside my chest cracked open in a way that wasn't painful, but warm and steady, like a door opening to fresh air after being locked in a room too long. He said she didn't respond after that and simply finished her iced tea before leaving the restaurant without saying goodbye. But less than 20 minutes after he got home, my phone rang, and of course it was my mother, her voice sharp and wounded, as if she had been the one attacked during that lunch. She accused Daniel of disrespecting her and said he was trying to isolate me from my family. She even said men like him manipulate vulnerable women because they know they can control them. And when I tried to defend him, she snapped back with something that chilled me more than the accusation itself. She said, "Emily, you don't understand what you are. You need someone strong enough to handle you." And then she hung up before I could respond, leaving me sitting at the kitchen table staring at the silent phone in my hand, while two versions of reality fought inside my mind. One where my mother was still the grieving widow trying to protect her only daughter, and another where she was quietly trying to dismantle every relationship that might pull me out of her orbit. And the terrifying part was realizing that for the first time in my life, the second version felt closer to the truth. 6 weeks before the wedding, the rumors started, not loudly at first, but quietly, the way gossip moves through a small town like Oak Ridge, where news doesn't travel in straight lines. It jumps from porch to porch, from church parking lot to grocery store checkout lanes, and the first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday afternoon when I walked into Patty's hair salon on Main Street for my usual trim. Patty had been cutting my hair since I was 14, so she knew every phase of my life, every breakup, every exam, every holiday story. and when she draped the black cape around my shoulders and leaned close to the mirror, she lowered her voice and asked gently, "Honey, are you okay?" The question caught me off guard because I had walked in smiling, talking about lesson plans and the heat outside, so I asked what she meant, and she hesitated for a moment before saying that my mother had stopped by the salon the day before and mentioned that things weren't going well at home, that wedding stress had been affecting me, and that Daniel might not be the right match for someone in my condition. I forced a small laugh and told Patty everything was fine because the alternative would have required explaining a truth I was still trying to understand myself. But the unease stayed with me all afternoon, and the next day it became impossible to ignore when I went to Dale's Market for groceries and Mrs. Brewer at the register gave me a look that was so full of pity, it felt like a spotlight shining on something I couldn't see. She reached across the counter and squeezed my hand and said, "Emily, if you ever need someone to talk to, you know the church counselors are always available." And suddenly I understood that my mother hadn't simply shared concerns with one or two people. She had seeded an entire story throughout the town, a story where I was fragile, unstable, possibly even unwell, and Daniel was the misguided man rushing into a marriage he didn't fully understand. Within 48 hours, I began noticing the subtle changes everywhere, the quiet glances when I walked into the post office, the overly gentle tone parents used when dropping their kids off at school, the whispers that stopped when I passed by. Oak Ridge had barely 5,000 residents, and in a town that size, rumors didn't need proof to become truth. They only needed repetition. That Thursday evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Sophia that said simply, "Don't react to anything your mom does this week. Trust me." And the message made my stomach twist because it sounded less like advice and more like a warning. I texted back asking what she meant, but all she replied with was, "Just wait." And that night, when Daniel and I were sitting on the porch watching the sun go down behind the pine trees, he mentioned that his own mother had received a strange phone call earlier that day from mine asking if the Brooks family knew about my history. Daniel said the word carefully, as if it might explode if spoken too loudly. And in that moment, I realized the rumors were no longer confined to hair salons and grocery stores. My mother was calling everyone connected to our wedding, one by one, and planting the same story. Emily is fragile. Emily isn't stable enough for marriage. Emily needs someone to protect her from herself. And as the cicadas hummed in the warm evening air, I felt something settle inside me that I had been avoiding for years, a slow, heavy understanding that this wasn't accidental gossip or misguided concern. This was strategy. My mother wasn't just worried about losing me. She was preparing the entire town to believe that the wedding should never happen at all. 5 weeks before the wedding, the situation grew worse. But strangely, the more chaotic things became, the calmer Sophia seemed, which should have been my first clue that something bigger was unfolding behind the scenes. Because while my mother was spreading rumors around Oak Ridge, Sophia had started quietly gathering information. Though I didn't realize that until much later at the time, all I noticed was how observant she had become, how she watched everything my mother did with a kind of quiet patience that almost felt strategic. One evening, she came over while Daniel and I were going through the guest list at the kitchen table and asked casually if I still had the original spreadsheet from the day Daniel proposed, the one before my mother had started editing it. I told her I probably did somewhere in my laptop files, and she asked if I could send it to her, just in case. I didn't think much about it, because Sophia had always been organized in ways I wasn't. But looking back, that was the moment she started building something that would eventually save the entire wedding. Meanwhile, my mother escalated her campaign. She called Daniel's mother, Linda, late one night, claiming she was worried about my mental health, and said the word episodes, as if my grief from years ago had been some recurring instability. Daniel put the call on speaker so I could hear, and I will never forget the way Linda's voice sounded when she repeated what my mother had said. It wasn't angry or accusatory. It was cautious. The voice of someone trying to understand if there was a truth hidden somewhere inside the accusation. And when Daniel calmly explained that I had spoken with a counselor after losing my father and nothing more, Linda simply said, "I believe you," but I could hear the doubt my mother had planted lingering in the silence afterward. That night, Daniel finally said something he had been holding back for weeks. He said quietly, "Emily, your mother isn't trying to protect you. She's trying to keep you." And the sentence hit me harder than any rumor, because deep down I had known it for years, but never allowed myself to say it out loud. The idea that my mother loved me, but also needed me to stay dependent on her, had always felt too painful to confront directly. Yet the evidence was everywhere now. Every phone call she made chipped away at another relationship in my life. Every rumor pushed me further into a corner where she would be the only person left standing beside me. What I didn't know was that Sophia had already decided months earlier that she wouldn't let that happen the night my mother first offered to take control of the wedding planning. Sophia had gone home and made a decision of her own. She opened her laptop and started searching venues within 30 minutes of Oak Ridge that could hold 200 guests on short notice. She contacted a garden estate owned by an event planner named June Whitfield and reserved it under her own name with a small deposit from her personal savings. Reached out to a florist she trusted in Carterville and asked if they could recreate the wildflower arrangements I had originally dreamed about. She spoke with a barbecue caterer known for wedding receptions and secured a tentative booking. She even contacted a photographer friend and a local musician willing to play acoustic guitar during a ceremony if needed. And she did all of this without telling me because she had known something I refused to see. She knew my mother long enough to recognize the pattern, the way celebrations in my life somehow always became battles for control, so she built a backup plan quietly and patiently, the way someone builds a safety net beneath a tightrope walker who doesn't realize they're about to fall. And while I was still trying to believe the situation would somehow calm down on its own, Sophia was already preparing for the moment when everything my mother touched would collapse. 7 days before the wedding was a Monday, an ordinary school day that began like any other. I was sitting at my desk during lunch, grading spelling tests, while the sound of children playing on the playground drifted through the open classroom window. And the only reason I picked up my phone at all was because I suddenly realized I hadn't confirmed the flower delivery with the florist. It was meant to be a routine check, the kind brides make constantly during the final week of planning. So I dialed Magnolia Garden Florals, expecting a quick conversation and a cheerful confirmation. But when the woman on the other end answered and I introduced myself, there was a pause that lasted just a little too long. The kind of pause that makes your stomach tighten before your brain even understands why. Then she said carefully, "Miss Carter, your order was canceled 3 days ago." The pencil in my hand stopped moving, and I remember staring at the worksheet in front of me without actually seeing it. I asked her to repeat what she had said, because for a moment I thought I must have misunderstood. But she explained again that a woman identifying herself as Margaret Carter had called to cancel the entire order and informed them the wedding had been called off. The words seemed to echo inside my head like they had been spoken down a long hallway. I hung up without saying goodbye and immediately dialed the caterer, hoping there had been some mistake. But the man who answered the phone sounded apologetic when he told me the same story. My mother had called on Thursday and canceled the reception order, claiming the ceremony would no longer happen. I felt my fingers starting to shake as I ended the call and dialed the venue next, already knowing what I was going to hear. Before the manager even finished her first sentence, she said, "Mrs." Carter had informed them the family had decided to cancel the event, and therefore the reservation had been released. When I finally lowered the phone, my hands were trembling so badly I had to place them flat on the desk just to steady them. The classroom felt strangely quiet, even though the playground outside was still full of noise. And in that moment, something inside me shifted from confusion to a cold clarity I had never felt before, because this wasn't a misunderstanding or a scheduling error. It was deliberate. My mother had systematically dismantled the entire wedding behind my back. I called her immediately, and she answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting for the call all morning. I didn't bother with small talk or questions. I simply said, "You canceled my wedding." And for a second, there was silence on the line before she responded in a calm voice that somehow sounded even more frightening than anger. She said, "I canceled a mistake." The simplicity of that sentence made my chest tighten. I told her it was not her decision to make, and she replied without hesitation, "Everything about you is my decision, Emily. I raised you, I protected you, and I will not watch you ruin your life." I remember gripping the edge of my desk so hard, the wood dug into my palms as I tried to keep my voice steady. I told her the wedding was not hers to give or take, and she laughed quietly before saying something that still echoes in my memory. She said, "Your life belongs to me more than it belongs to that man." And in that instant, something that had been sleeping inside me for nearly 28 years finally woke up. It wasn't rage exactly, it was colder than that. A realization that the woman on the other end of the phone would never stop trying to control my life unless I stopped letting her. So instead of arguing or begging, I simply said, "No, it doesn't," and hung up. When the call ended, the classroom suddenly felt very still, and I sat there staring at the silent phone in my hand, understanding that my wedding had just been erased with a few phone calls, and that I had exactly 7 days left before 200 guests arrived, expecting a ceremony that no longer existed. When I got home that afternoon, I don't remember the drive from the school to the house. I only remember sitting on the cold kitchen floor with my back against the dishwasher, still wearing my work clothes, while the late afternoon sunlight crept slowly across the wall, like time itself had thickened. My mind kept replaying the same thought over and over. The wedding was gone, the venue, the flowers, the food. Everything Daniel and I had spent 3 years saving for had disappeared in a handful of phone calls, and the strangest part was that I couldn't even cry. I just sat there feeling hollow. Daniel found me like that when he came in from the workshop with sawdust still on his forearms, and instead of asking questions, he simply sat down beside me on the floor, close enough that our shoulders touched. We stayed like that for almost 10 minutes, listening to the refrigerator hum, before I finally said the words out loud. She canceled everything. Daniel didn't look shocked, the way I expected. He just nodded slowly and asked, when I told him 3 days ago, and that she had pretended to be me when she called the vendors. He rubbed his hand across his jaw, thinking quietly for a moment before saying, "Then we figure out something else." I almost laughed because the idea felt impossible. We had 7 days, no venue, no caterer, no florist, and almost no money left to start again. But before I could respond, Daniel had already pulled out his phone and dialed Sophia when she answered. He explained what happened in a calm voice while I sat there listening. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Sophia said something that made both of us look at each other in confusion. She said, "Don't call any vendors and don't call your mother again. Give me 48 hours. Daniel asked what she meant, but she simply repeated the same sentence, 48 hours, trust me, and hung up before explaining anything else. Those next 2 days were the longest of my life because everything felt suspended in uncertainty. My mother seemed completely confident. She had ended the wedding, and she even called Daniel late one night trying to convince him to walk away from the relationship before I ruined his life. He didn't tell me about that call until later, but he quietly recorded the conversation on his phone while she repeated the same accusations about my mental stability, accusations that sounded even more cruel when spoken out loud. The morning of the second day, Sophia arrived at our house carrying a thick manila folder, and the moment she set it down on the kitchen table, I could see Daniel's posture change slightly because something about her expression told him this wasn't going to be bad news. She sat across from us and said calmly, "Before you react, I need you to let me finish." Then she opened the folder and spread several documents across the table, like someone presenting evidence in a courtroom. The first paper was a signed contract for a place called Rosewood Garden. Estate of private property 12 minutes outside Oak Ridge, owned by an event planner named June Whitfield. The contract had Sophia's name on it and the date printed clearly across the top 6 months earlier. I stared at it in disbelief because that date was the same week my mother had taken over the wedding planning. Sophia looked at me and said softly, "The day your mom volunteered to run the wedding, I started making backup plans." The words hung in the air between us, and suddenly every strange thing she had said over the past few months made sense. She pulled out another sheet showing a florist from Carterville who specialized in wildflower arrangements, exactly the kind I had originally wanted before my mother replaced them with white roses. Then a catering agreement with Big Jim's Smokehouse pulled pork cornbread and sweet tea served in mason jars. Daniel actually laughed when he saw that part, because it was the first moment in weeks that anything had felt real again. Sophia continued flipping through the folder, explaining that she had lined up a photographer friend, a DJ willing to help on short notice, and even a list of every guest we originally planned to invite before my mother edited the contacts. The total cost for the entire backup wedding was about $6,500, and Sophia had already paid the deposit herself. When I tried to protest, she raised her hand and said, "You can pay me back whenever you want. That part isn't important." What mattered was the final page she placed on the table, a printed spreadsheet of nearly 200 names with phone numbers and email addresses. She explained that on the morning of the wedding, she would send a message to every guest saying the venue had been upgraded to a new location, a surprise change meant to make the ceremony even better. Everyone would receive the new address, except one person. I didn't even need to ask who that person was, because Sophia looked directly at me and said quietly, "Your mother will only know about the original venue." And in that moment, I realized something extraordinary had happened while my mother had been busy tearing my life apart. Someone else had been quietly rebuilding it piece by piece behind the scenes. The morning of the wedding arrived so quietly it almost felt unreal. After weeks of chaos and months of manipulation, everything suddenly slowed down into a strange calm that made the air itself feel lighter. I woke up before sunrise in the small guest room at Sophia's house, and for a moment I forgot what day it was, until I saw the dress hanging on the closet door, a simple ivory dress that wasn't the one my mother had chosen, but the one I had loved from the very beginning. And when the sunlight started creeping through the curtains, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Sophia knocked softly on the door and stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee, and said with a small smile, "Today is the day we take your life back." Those words stayed with me all morning while we drove out to Rosewood Garden Estate. The place looked even more beautiful than the photos in the contract. A wide green lawn surrounded by tall maple trees, with strings of warm lights hanging above the wooden ceremony arch, and long rustic tables already arranged under a white canopy. Daniel was already there with his brother, helping the caterers unload trays of food, and when he saw me step out of the car, he stopped what he was doing and just stared for a moment, like he needed to convince himself this was actually happening. We didn't even speak at first. He just walked over slowly and wrapped his arms around me in a quiet hug that felt like the beginning of something new rather than the end of a fight. Guests started arriving about an hour later, and everything unfolded exactly the way Sophia had planned it. Friends from the school, Daniel's co-workers, my aunt from Denver, even my childhood neighbor, Mrs. Carter, who had baked the same apple pie she used to make when I was a kid. Every person who walked through the garden gate greeted us with confusion first, and then laughter, when they realized the venue upgrade message had been part of a surprise. It felt like the kind of wedding I had always imagined, but never thought I'd actually have. Simple, warm and real. And for the first time since the engagement, I wasn't thinking about my mother at all. But somewhere across town, she was thinking about us, because at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed in Sophia's purse where we had hidden it earlier that morning. The caller ID said, "Mom." Sophia looked at the screen and raised an eyebrow before silencing the call without answering. She turned the phone face down on the table and said, "Let her enjoy the surprise." Later that evening, I would learn exactly what had happened at the original venue. My mother had arrived early, wearing the navy dress she had shown everyone for months, expecting to watch the disaster she believed she had created unfold in front of 200 confused guests. But when she stepped into the empty ballroom, she found something very different. No decorations, no chairs, no music, only a single envelope sitting on the welcome table addressed to her in Sophia's handwriting. Inside was a short note that read, "The wedding isn't here, Linda. It never was." And underneath that sentence was a printed photograph taken earlier that day, showing Daniel and me standing together beneath the wooden arch at Rosewood Garden Estate, with all our friends gathered around us smiling. The photo had been delivered by a courier exactly 30 minutes before the ceremony started, while she was still standing alone in the silent hall. Back in the garden, the music began playing, and Daniel took his place near the arch, while Sophia squeezed my hand gently and whispered, "Ready?" I nodded, because for the first time in years, there was nothing left to be afraid of. The walk down that grass aisle felt longer than any distance I had ever traveled, but every step carried me further away from the life my mother had tried to control. When I reached Daniel, he took my hands and smiled in a way that made the entire crowd disappear for a moment. And as the officiant began speaking the first lines of the ceremony, I realized something simple but powerful. My mother had spent years believing she was the center of my story, but on that day she wasn't even in the room. The ceremony ended just as the evening light began turning golden across the garden, and for a while I allowed myself to forget that the outside world even existed. Daniel and I were standing beneath the string lights, surrounded by laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of music, while people drifted between the tables with plates of barbecue and mason jars filled with lemonade. It felt simple and real in a way no ballroom wedding ever could have been. But the peace didn't last forever, because just after sunset, Sophia's phone buzzed quietly in her hand, and the expression on her face changed the moment she read the message. She didn't say anything immediately, but I could tell something had happened. A few minutes later, she pulled Daniel and me aside near the edge of the garden where the music sounded distant and showed us the screen. It was a message from one of the vendors my mother had canceled weeks earlier, the florist from Greenville who had called me crying that morning. The message contained a single line that made my chest tighten the moment I read it. "Your mother just arrived here asking questions." For a few seconds, none of us spoke. The night air felt cooler suddenly, and the distant sound of laughter from the reception made the moment feel strangely surreal. Daniel finally exhaled slowly and said, "So she figured it out." But Sophia shook her head. "Not exactly. She thinks someone tricked her." She turned the phone slightly. so we could read the rest of the message. Apparently, my mother had spent the entire afternoon driving between different vendors, demanding to know why the wedding wasn't happening, insisting there must have been a mistake. When no one could give her answers, she began accusing people of sabotaging the event behind her back. The florist wrote that she seemed furious and confused at the same time, repeating the same sentence over and over. Emily couldn't have done this. She doesn't know how. Hearing that line made something inside me shift, because for the first time I realized the one thing my mother had never imagined was that I might eventually learn to fight back. She had spent years convincing herself I was weak, that I needed her guidance, that I would always stay quiet. But tonight proved something different, and somehow that truth was harder for her to accept than the wedding itself. The reception continued for another hour before Sophia pulled me aside again with a more serious expression than before. She told me she had something important to show me and led me toward the small wooden office near the entrance of the estate where the music faded behind us. Once the door closed, she opened her laptop and played a short audio recording that Daniel recognized immediately. It was the phone call my mother had made to him a few nights earlier, trying to convince him to leave me, but hearing the conversation again in the quiet room felt completely different. Her voice sounded colder than I remembered, sharper, almost calculated, as she repeated the same accusations about my mental instability, about how marrying me would ruin his future, about how she had spent years protecting people from my episodes. When the recording ended, the silence in the room felt heavy. Sophia looked at me and said calmly, "There's more." Then she showed me the final document inside the folder she had brought days earlier. It was a notarized statement written by the receptionist from the clinic where my mother worked, describing a conversation she overheard weeks ago between my mother and one of her coworkers. According to the statement, my mother had been openly discussing her plan to cancel the wedding and make Daniel believe I had done it myself so that he would eventually leave. Reading those words in black and white made my hands tremble slightly because the manipulation I had always suspected was now undeniable proof. Sophia closed the laptop slowly and said, "You have everything you need now if you ever decide to confront her." I sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the weight of what she meant. For years, my mother had controlled the narrative of my life, telling relatives, neighbors, and even my own fiancé that I was unstable, that I needed supervision, that I couldn't be trusted with important decisions. But tonight, that story had finally cracked open. Daniel knocked softly on the office door a moment later and stepped inside with 2 glasses of champagne. He looked from Sophia to me and asked if everything was okay. I nodded slowly and took the glass from his hand, because standing there in the quiet room, I understood something important. The wedding might have been the first victory, but the real battle for the truth had only just begun. The reception ended late that night with the kind of quiet happiness that lingers long after the music stops. Guests hugged us goodbye under the soft glow of the garden lights, and one by one the cars disappeared down the long gravel driveway until the estate finally grew silent again. Daniel and I stayed behind with Sophia and a few close friends, helping stack chairs and pack away the last trays of food. It felt strangely peaceful, doing something so ordinary after a day that had been anything but ordinary. And when the last car finally drove away, Daniel wrapped his jacket around my shoulders and asked softly if I was ready to go home. But before I could answer, my phone buzzed again in Sophia's hand, where we had left it earlier that evening. The screen lit up with the same name I had spent the entire day avoiding. Mom. For a moment, none of us moved. Daniel looked at me carefully and said, "You don't have to answer." But I surprised even myself by reaching for the phone and pressing accept. The line was silent for 2 seconds before her voice came through sharp and controlled, the way it always did when she was trying to hide anger. "Where are you?" she asked without greeting. I glanced around the empty garden, with the wooden arch still standing quietly behind us, and said the simplest answer I could think of. "At my wedding." There was a pause long enough that I could almost hear her breathing on the other end before she spoke again, this time louder, accusing, demanding to know how I had managed to change the venue without telling her, who helped me, why everyone was suddenly lying to her. The questions spilled out quickly, like she believed if she talked fast enough, she could regain control of the situation. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I simply listened until she finally stopped speaking, and then I said something she had never heard from me before. "You tried to destroy my wedding." The silence that followed was heavier than anything she had said before, because she realized I knew the truth. She tried denying it at first, insisting there had been misunderstandings, blaming the vendors, blaming Daniel, even blaming Sophia. But every excuse collapsed the moment I mentioned the recording of her phone call and the written statement from her coworker. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just calmly explained that the story she had spent years telling about me was finished now, that Daniel knew everything, and so did the people who mattered most to me. When she finally spoke again, the anger had drained out of her voice, leaving something colder behind, something almost desperate. "You're choosing them over your own mother?" she asked quietly, and for a moment the old guilt tried to rise inside my chest, the way it always had before. But standing there beside Daniel, under the quiet lights of that garden, I realized something simple. I wasn't choosing anyone over her. I was choosing myself. So I answered with the only truth that mattered. "No, I'm choosing my life." She didn't respond immediately, and when she finally spoke again, her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. She said, "You'll regret this one day." And then the line went dead before I could say anything else. I lowered the phone slowly and looked around the empty garden again. The chairs were stacked. The candles had burned down to quiet pools of wax, and the wooden arch, where Daniel and I had exchanged vows, stood alone against the dark sky like a silent witness to everything that had happened. Daniel stepped closer and asked if I was okay. I nodded, because the strange, tight feeling that had lived in my chest for years was finally gone. Sophia walked over and placed the old manila folder back in my hands before saying something I will probably remember for the rest of my life. "Some families are built by blood. The best ones are built by truth." Daniel squeezed my hand gently, and together we walked down the gravel path toward the car waiting at the gate. leaving the garden behind us as husband and wife, and for the first time since I was a child, the future felt like something that actually belonged to me.